All right, so here's my lecture on Euthyphro. Hard to pronounce. Just think of youth, if, and the hairdo, fro. This is my little PowerPoints here. You can't really see. So that I could make sure that I'm lecturing with the PowerPoint for those of you who are my students, as opposed to other people wandering upon this video in YouTube or something like that. Okay, so this is Plato's Euthyphro dialogue. And Plato was a follower of Socrates in the 4th century to 5th century BCE, before the Common Era, or before Christ. Little bit of background: Socrates never really wrote anything philosophical. He was like a mason, like a stone cutter or something like that, a construction worker, actually, a former war hero. He lived in Athens, which was kind of like the New York City of ancient Greece. He was an old man. At the time of this reading, he was on his way into court. So I believe he was around 80 or 70 when he was 70 or 80 when he was on his way into court to be tried. Shortly afterwards, he was found guilty and executed. But this dialogue is named the Euthyphro. Plato followed Socrates around the way, people follow Buddha around, or Jesus, or some other great sage, wise man, holy man, prophet. And what Plato did was he would write down and take notes. Whenever Socrates had an interesting debate with somebody like Euthyphro, he would name the discussion after the person with whom Socrates was having the discussion. And Socrates had some discussions with many other noteworthy or famous philosophers, and those discussions were named after those people, like Parmenides, Gorgias, Meno, and so on. Okay, so I have on my first slide a picture of 3 busts of statues of Socrates in the middle. I think Plato is on the left and Aristotle is on the right. It's pretty small here. Yes, okay, just enlarged it. I think these statues were made back when, and so it's possible that that's sort of what they look like, but who knows? All right. So on the first slide, the question is, what is holiness? What is piety? What is goodness? All right. Going to the second slide, what you're going to notice in this dialogue is what's called the Socratic Method, which is a kind of lawyer-like method. Most law schools teach using what they call the Socratic Method, which is a method of question and answer and cross-examination. Just simply really critical thinking and questioning. Most law schools focus more on that than they do on the law itself. They use the Socratic Method as a way of teaching. One movie that well illustrates this is called The Paper Chase. It's an old movie. All right, so according to this method, some authority figure makes a statement that might be problematic. In our very first assignment in our class, if you recall, I said there's this combination of what and why. What you believe, which is the conclusion that you've come to, and why is your reasons, your evidence, your grounds for having that belief, right? Why do you believe it? So usually some authority makes a what statement, some kind of claim or a conclusion, and then Socrates questions them why they believe it, or what exactly do they mean, right? Because often our statements are ambiguous. So what exactly do you mean, and why do you believe that? And the speaker replies, and then Socrates evaluates the speaker's answers. Right? Does it make sense? Is that a good reason? Is the reason true? Is it consistent with our general knowledge or with other things that the speaker believes? Do those reasons really support that conclusion? Those premises and conclusion together, or a claim that you have and the reasons for it are an argument, recall. So the argument is the key unit of philosophical focus in Western philosophy. So if the answers to those questions don't make sense, then the process is repeated. Of course, if the answers are very clear, then you move on to another topic and you've established some credible claims. Okay, but most of the Socratic dialogues end in uncertainty. And this is part and parcel of Socrates' intuition or insight into the nature of human knowledge, that like kind of the more that we learn about something and the more deeply we look into it, the more we realize how little we really understand and know about it. And that wisdom is a kind of awareness of the limitations of human knowledge, or an awareness of our own ignorance. Children are very philosophical. They illustrate this with the question, why? I think their instincts are good, even though they're young. Many of us stop asking why after a while. But one of the main intuitions that you see that Socrates is illustrating is that almost every belief and every claim and every concept is worth examining. And that when we examine them, it's like touching a soap bubble. So pretty you want to grab it and then you touch it and it pops. So the more deeply we go into a concept, the more problematic it seems. This seems to be a kind of moral of the story that comes out of much of Socrates' use of his own method, the Socratic method. Okay, so the next slide is about the backgrounds of Greek polytheism, the belief in many gods. The Greeks believed in the gods the way that Muslims today believe in Allah, or the Jews in Moses' day believed in the stories about Abraham and Adam and all of that stuff. They really believed in these things, and this is the religion of the day that in Socrates' time, right? So, and the sources for many of the religious beliefs came from Homer, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Hesiod, the author of the book called Theogony, which is the genealogy or birth of the gods, which is about the generations of the gods. In these stories, like the Iliad about the Trojan War, which happened 1300 BC, which was about, I suppose, 8 centuries before Socrates' time. It wasn't that long ago. The Greeks thought this was in the past, a kind of magical past, but they still believed that the gods were around, right? It's not like it was the way modern Christians might think, Jesus 2,000 years ago, that kind of thing. No, the Greeks were still living in a world where when there was lightning or a storm at sea, they thought that Zeus or Poseidon were literally angry. So I mentioned in my slide that, we could view the which is view the Greeks, Greek view. View the Greek gods at least 2 different possible ways. One like myths, and then the modern anthropological explanation about that is that they're kind of primitive, magical-minded people who didn't know any better, would interpret things in human terms. We call this human or anthropomorphic, having the form of a human. Anthropo, man, anthropos. Anthropomorphic projection. So like when you see a dog and it shows its teeth, you think it's smiling, but it might be ready to bite you. That's projecting onto a non-human, a human attribute. That's projection of anthropomorphic qualities, right? So usually when humans, and animals, by the way, are angry, they're loud and they break things, they make lots of noise. So thunder and lightning and tsunamis and tidal waves and all the storms at sea all seem like the sky or the sea is angry. And if something is angry, then it's conscious. It has a mind and a will and emotions, right? So it's just one little step to thinking that the sea is a spirit or a god or something like that. And then another step to give them names like Zeus and Poseidon. Right? So that's the anthropologist's way to dismiss it as a kind of error of primitive, superstitious human thinking, lack of scientific knowledge. But what if there were Greek gods? So consider this. If there is life after death and you have a spirit and it lives on after you die, and there's psychic phenomena and psychic energy and things like the force and all that, the things that the animists, the believers that everything has a kind of force in it, nature and supernature are blended together. If there's evolution in the natural world, couldn't there be evolution in the supernatural world? Couldn't there be powerful, non-physical beings that are made up of some kind of psychic energy like a ghost or a god? And that the Greeks actually were in communication with some of them? That is a possibility. I would like you to consider it. You consider that there's an invisible being called God, right? But maybe there are all sorts of supernatural beings that can interfere with human affairs. This is what the Greeks believed. This is not a peculiarly Greek idea. I think most human beings around the time believed something like that, and for thousands of years. And for most of human history, 99% of human history, human beings were animists, so we believed in nature and supernature intertwined. Okay, I'll say one more thing. The poets like Homer and Hesiod, they spoke epic, their poems were epic length, meaning biblical length books that rhymed, right? And when the Greeks heard rhyming poetry with such richness and meaning about the gods, they thought that this was the language of the gods, the way that people think that Christians who are possessed of the Holy Spirit speak in tongues, like the language of angels or something like that. Or Muslims believe that the Quran, the rich literary quality of the Quran is so high that human beings couldn't have authored it. It had to come from the angel Gabriel, right? Angelic speak or divine speech. Right? I mean, when you hear people rhyming spontaneously, even rappers who are really good, it's totally spontaneous and not rehearsed. That's something that's amusing and enrapturing. It's like, it seems like a gift that we don't normally have. The Greeks believed that when somebody was a really good poet, that they actually were channeling a Greek god, one of the daughters of Zeus, the Muses. I believe there were 9 or 10 of them, right? They believed to be possessed and speaking through them. So it was as if similar to the angel Gabriel speaking the Quran to Muhammad in the cave, which is what created Islam. The Greeks believed that the gods spoke through Homer and Hesiod and the other great poets, right? And they treated those books and those poets like prophets and like scriptures. They quoted them, they referred to them, they got all their morals from them. Those books informed all of their culture and their values, okay? And in those texts, heroism, to be a hero, to have great virtue, right? Wisdom, courage, temperance, justice, those are great virtues, right? The Greeks put these things up on a pedestal as if having those things in you made you immortal almost, right? To become a hero, to become a truly just man, right? You'll wind up in Hades with the gods. You'll be able to communicate with them. Now, Socrates stepped into this world, and he wasn't the first Western philosopher, but he's considered the father, quotes, of Western philosophy, only because he was such a giant philosophically. There were some Western philosophers in maybe roughly 200 to 300 years before him, but we only have fragments of what they said, which were recorded by certain historians or by Aristotle, who was like kind of Socrates' philosophical grandchild, because Plato followed Socrates around. He was a young man when Socrates walked the earth, and almost like a kind of student of Socrates. And then Plato opened up the first university in the Western world called the Academy, which is why what we're doing is called academic. And Aristotle and Euclid, among others, were students in Plato's Academy. Euclid invented geometry. Aristotle invented logic, biology, and a variety of other fields and wrote encyclopedia-sized books about all of them. Okay, and then Aristotle's student, Alexander the Great, took over the known world. I would imagine trying to implement the ideas that came from Plato, Aristotle's teacher, in the Republic about one world and no wars. All right. Okay. So that's that slide. But the background of Greek polytheism and how real it was when they came along. My next slide says Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So I'm speaking ahead of the slide. Let me take a quick look at this. Yeah, the first philosopher in the West was Thales, who had this silly view that everything was made out of water. Silly as it is, it's an attempt at a natural explanation of nature as opposed to a supernatural explanation of nature, right? The gods are angry, lightning and Titanic, things in the ocean, these are the gods of the sky, and it's the sea and the earth, the earth goddess Gaia, and so on, right? The nature philosophers try to give natural explanations for the rainbow and for all this kind of thing, right? So, and they were like primitive scientific theories. So Thales thought everything is water. Seems silly. How could it be? But he thought water can be solid, liquid, or gas. So it has this power of transforming states of matter into three. And it must have been an interesting discovery when you see ice or snow melt, and then when you see steam condense and form water, right, and realize that it's all the same substance, right? And then they also thought the Greek world was surrounded by water. All living things have water and liquid in them if you cut them open. And little rocks, which are really seeds, they come alive because of water. So many things that we didn't realize were water related. So maybe other things that we don't understand to be water are really some other kind of form of water, right? And there were other philosophers like Heraclitus, who thought everything was made out of fire. If you substitute the word energy for fire, it's a similar kind of thing like water, only it makes a little bit more sense. Anaximenes, who thought everything was air, because the universe, he thought was spinning around, and if you spun around a bowl with water and some light and heavy things in it and try to mix the air in with it, it's too light, it wouldn't mix in, and the lighter things would float on top, and the heavier things like pebbles and whatnot, sand and twigs would go to the bottom. So he thought when things are swirling, they become heavier and dense in the middle. And he thought the earth was in the middle of a cosmic swirl, but it was all actually made out of the same stuff as air, just like maybe water, right? That kind of thing. And then there was earth, air, water, fire, and all those are the nature philosophers. And then another group of philosophers called the sophists, which literally means wise men, like Sophia, philo, love, Sophia, wisdom. These were kind of like early social scientists because they traveled around the world and noticed how other religions and cultures and legal systems and sciences of the Egyptians, the Persians, the Ethiopians, and so on and so forth. And they came back. They were like social scientists. So you had like natural scientists and social scientists, primitive. But one example I like to give is a fellow named Xenophanes, starts with an X, who said that, African gods are black, Greek gods look Greek, and these other people, the Thracians, who are blonde-haired and blue-eyed, their gods are blonde-haired and blue-eyed. He said if animals could speak, their gods would resemble them, meaning monkeys would have a monkey god and so on. So the implication is that man makes God in his own image, not the other way around. This is a kind of really interesting early anthropology, sociology of religion, right? Fascinating little thing going on there. So there were these fragments of nature philosophy and of sophists traveling around the time Socrates was in Athens, and whenever any one of them would come and lecture in Athens, Socrates would be there, he'd interrogate them, right? And he'd study with them if he could for a while, and then always leave scratching his head thinking they don't really know. And some of those are in dialogue form that Plato wrote down. So let's see, what else do I have on the slide? Yeah, that's about it. Oh yeah, there were other ancient period universities. There was one in Timbuktu, another one somewhere else in Africa. I forget where. There was one in India, north, the Himalayan area, a Buddhist university called Nalanda, which was immense. Yeah. So I'll say one other thing about Socrates. He was a kind of sage. He was a kind of mystic. He would go into trances standing up. He could drink anyone under the table. And Plato, I have a little note here. Plato's his most famous student. He wrote it all down. 3 stages of Plato, maybe 2. Scholars disagree about this. I've heard 2, I've heard 3. But in the dialogues, it really is mostly Socrates. But dia means 2 in Greek, and log from logos, which means word. Logic comes from that. Dialogue, 2 words, 2 people speaking, really. Monologue, 1 person speaking. So the Platonic dialogues, most of the earlier ones are actually Socrates, and the later ones are believed to be Plato, just creating Socrates and using him as a character, maybe so that Plato wouldn't get killed like Socrates got killed for being a philosopher. Okay, next slide, Euclid. We don't need to look at that. You want to look it up on Google or on Wikipedia, but Euclid invented geometry. Very simple. Axioms means postulates of reason, like the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. You put lines together, you could form a kind of square, and put squares together, and you could form a cube 3-dimensionally, all this kind of stuff. So, but the idea is that from the axioms, which are self-evident principles, like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, you can deduce using logic theorems, which are logical implications about things like triangles and geometry and all sorts of other things. Fascinating stuff. And the Romans applied Euclid's geometry, and so did the Greeks, in their architecture and stuff like that. Okay, Aristotle, I mentioned, he opened the second university called the Lyceum. These universities were named after where they were. Reason Aristotle didn't stay in Plato's was after Plato died, an older student had seniority, and Aristotle wanted no part of that. He was obviously smarter, because I don't even think most people know who the name of that older student was. The logic that he invented is called categorical logic. It's the logic of categories, how one category is related to another. So like whales are mammals and mammals are animals. Therefore, if something is a whale, it's a mammal. And if something is a mammal, it's an animal, right? So all whales are mammals, all mammals are animals. It follows logically that all whales are animals, right? That kind of thing. All A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. Right, but Aristotle also defined definition, and this will come up later in the slide, with this category thing. To define something, he thought, you give the smallest conceptual category of the type of thing that it is. That's the genus, G-E-N-U-S. And then you give the species, which is the characteristic that separates it from other things in that category, or differentiates it. So the sample is for a biological brother as opposed to a soul brother. You're my brother. Right? Biological brother, the smallest conceptual category is sibling. Right? Family member is too large. It has cousins and whatnot. Brother is a sibling, that's the genus, and what differentiates brothers from other siblings is maleness, right? Or being male. So that's the species. A brother, therefore, is a male sibling. This is the identity of a brother. It's in this category, it's not in that one. So genus is how things are alike, and species is how they differ. Alike and different are the nature of identity, what a thing is. It is what it is and not anything else, and it excludes everything that it is not. Right? So this kind of category inclusion thing, just from the nature of defining a thing as what it is, then leads to logic. The law of identity, a thing is what it is, it's not something else. Right? So this is all fascinating stuff that Aristotle got just by doing this. Really well, right? Which is analytical thinking or critical thinking or logical analysis. Okay. Oh, and I said Aristotle invented biology. When Alexander the Great, his student, took over the known world, him and his generals from different military campaigns would bring back species of plants and animals for Aristotle to classify using his taxonomy, which is a classification scheme based on category inclusion, right? And laws of identity and logic. And Aristotle, 99+% of his classifications, his taxonomy of living things, are still valid today. The only exceptions are some rare cases where things seemed like they belonged in the same category, but they had evolved along different lines. And we only discovered that when we learned genetics and found out that they look very similar, but they have different genetic histories. They didn't evolve the same way, but they came about to look alike in a way, to look like cousins, although they may be very distant relatives, that sort of thing. Okay. Aristotle wrote books on everything: metaphysics, physics, ethics, rhetoric, politics, whatever, you name it. He also influenced the education anybody would get in Europe, all the way up until the modern era, through the church, because through the Renaissance period, Maimonides in Judaism and St. Thomas Aquinas in Catholicism, both humongous theological minds and philosophical genius level beings, based all their knowledge on Aristotle, because they got this if you got an education in Europe up until the modern era, through the church or whatever, you got an education in Aristotle and Aristotle's logic and his physics and everything else. And so the two of them, Maimonides and Aquinas, referred to Aristotle simply as the philosopher. And they incorporated Aristotle's philosophy into Judaism and into Catholicism. And in fact, Aquinas admittedly says he loves what Maimonides did. He studied what Maimonides did. He's going to do that for Catholicism, and he did, which is just apply Aristotle to the religion and make it more philosophical than it already was. Of course, Judaism was already very philosophical. Okay, so all of that is background, and now we're going to talk about the Euthyphro dialogue. And if you read my version of it in the Dropbox, you read the one that talks all about holiness. Pardon me, but I have a dry mouth from speaking. I have a mint and a little water here. The Greek word in the original is hosion, H-O-S-I-O-N. And it could be translated as holiness or holy or piety or pious. It means both, right? But in English, I think in this dialogue, it should only mean piety, because the dialogue is only about human beings and actions, and only human beings and actions can be pious, whereas objects, places, and things and people and actions can be holy. Holy water, holy grounds, holy temple, all those sorts of things, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is the Greeks had this concept of what's called the unity of the virtues, which means that a truly virtuous or good man would not just be somebody who was pious, right? A pious person in ordinary usage, a pious person is somebody who observes the rules of the religion, right? A pious Muslim prays facing Mecca 5 times a day, tries to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca, a Hajj, once in their lifetime. Pious Jews study the Torah, they observe the kosher dietary law, and so on, right? A pious Hindu, a pious Christian. These are people who observe the rules of the religion. That's the basic meaning of piety, right? But for the Greeks, that's not enough. To be truly pious or holy or good or righteous, to be a truly righteous human being, is to possess all of the virtues. You can't be somebody who observes the rules of the religion and be mean-spirited, selfish, envious, manipulator of your colleagues, right? Because those are vices, not virtues. So to be truly good is to possess all the virtues, right? They're all united. You don't really have them unless you have them all. All right. So we're going to stick with piety. Even though all the words you read were holy and holiness, I'm going to be talking about piety and the pious. Okay, so I already mentioned what next slide, pre-philosophical idea like piety without bringing Socrates into it. The observant person, religiously observant person is pious. One who goes to church, observes the rules, prays, whatever, right? In our culture, they're not automatically moral. You could have a person who wears a yarmulke, goes to the temple and is kosher and all of that, but mean-spirited and all. You wouldn't say that they're a holy person, right? In any religion, right? Okay, so piety and morality come apart in our culture, but in Greek culture they're united, right? But one of the deep questions of this issue in the dialogue is, do morals or does piety, does righteousness, goodness, morality, justice, do moral values really rest on God, or do they require God? Do they come from God? The religious believe that if you don't believe in God, or if there is no God, there's no reason to be moral, right? I have Dostoevsky on here. Do morals rest on God? Because he had made the argument that if there was no God, everything becomes possible, meaning morally possible. We can do whatever the hell we want. You die and it's over. That's it, right? But the question of the dialogue is that correct? And do morals really come from God? Or the gods, even in the Greek case, more than one God? Right? If there was no God, would there still be reasons to be moral? As you'll see, Socrates thinks the answer is yes. Okay, so next slide, prelude, courthouse. Socrates and Euthyphro bump into each other. Socrates tells Euthyphro why he's there. He's being charged with three things: corrupting the morals of the youth, rejecting the gods of Athens. I guess because he questions people like Euthyphro, explain piety to me, right? And then Euthyphro, as you see, if you read the dialogue, he has a hard time explaining it, right? So Socrates asked such pressing questions. He asked any kind of authority figure. If you were a politician, he would ask you, like, what is justice? If you were a high priest, he would ask you, what is holiness? Right? If he was a poet, he would ask the poets to explain their poems. Right? And most people couldn't really survive the cross-examination, the deep critical, philosophical, logical analysis that Socrates would subject them to. And they'd wind up looking stupid, tongue-tied, embarrassed, scratching their head, and their authority would be deflated, like poking a balloon, right? And so people took offense at this, and what with all the other philosophers around talking about other religions and other cultures, and also about nature, explaining nature, as opposed to God's explaining nature, the world was in a kind of philosophical confusion at the time. And so the society, Socrates lived in Athens, he was there his whole life, he was always questioning people publicly, he was seen with all these other philosophers questioning them, so he's a kind of symbolic figure, and they charged him, they brought him up on charges of kind of really just like rejecting the religion, right? Rejecting the religion of Athens, inventing his own religion, because he had other ideas about spirituality. And because of that, if you undercut the religion, it's believed that you're going to undercut the morals of the youth. Young people grow up, if they don't have faith in the religion, there goes the morals, right? So when Euthyphro hears about that, he says, the masses, they don't understand prophets like us. He uses that phrase. So Euthyphro recognizes that Socrates is a kind of prophet or prophetic holy man, a wise man, a sage. There was a great general named Alcibiades who claimed about Socrates, this is a sidebar, that he could tell when Socrates was in a house before he even saw or heard him. He could feel his presence. So he was a kind of prophetic kind of character, like a holy man, like a Buddha or something like that. And Euthyphro says they're probably accusing you of inventing new religions because of that talk that you have about your daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N, which means demon in English, but in Greek it just meant spirit. Because EU in front of it, like in euphoria or euthanasia or euphemism, eudaimonia, eudaimon, a eudaimon is a good-spirited person, and eudaimonia is good-spiritedness, the property of being good-spirited, right? So daimon just means spirit. But Socrates spoke as if he had a daimon, a spirit in him that would guide him and speak to him and stop him from doing things that were wrong. It was a kind of mystical, he considered it a divine sign, some kind of sign of the divinity in himself. Okay? And Socrates, one of his teachers, Diotima, by the way, was a leader, I believe, of a mystery cult. There were all these mystery cults that were these mystical cults. Many of them were followers of the god Apollo, the god of wisdom. Some of them were Orphic mystery cults. Orpheus, the guy, the poet, who used poetry to charm his way out of Hades. Some people believe that he came back to life. That must have been that he had a near-death experience and resuscitated and traveled to the underworld and all this, right? So Socrates might have had some of that in his background. Like I said, he stood in trances. He was really, when he was in prison, he had precognitive dreams about when he would die and stuff like that. So he's an interesting character. So now, that's why Socrates is in court. And Euthyphro is a high priest kind of character in the very religion that's charging Socrates with being a heretic, basically. A heretic is someone who rejects their own religion or comes up with doctrines that are taboo according to their religion, right? And so if Euthyphro, I mean, this demonstrates why Socrates is going to jail, or going to trial, actually, then winds up in jail, because he is undermining people's beliefs by getting them to examine them more deeply and realize that they don't really know what they think that they know. Right? For Socrates, wisdom is knowing the difference between what you know and what you don't know, or being aware of your own ignorance or the limitations of your beliefs. Right? So, but then when Euthyphro says why he's there, Socrates is alarmed because Euthyphro is there to prosecute his own father or to bring his father to court to really just face the charge of allowing a prisoner of his to die under his watch. So, you know, the Greeks and everybody else in the ancient world had slaves. Whoever won a war would enslave the losers. So Euthyphro's father had slaves and he had servants, and one of the slaves and servants got into a drunken brawl, and one killed the other, I forget which. And he bound him, and the killer, and put him in a ditch, and sent someone to town to get the authorities, but I guess it took too long, or it was the winter or something. For whatever reason, maybe he didn't feed him. The guy died. And so now Euthyphro, being a priest, remember justice is, the Greek statue is blind, holding scales, right? So if I stole 3 cows from you, you have to repay me the equivalent. Things have to be made equal no matter who you are, right? So Euthyphro, being a holy man, a high priest, with the unity of the virtues, right? If his father had some kind of injustice, even if it was unintended, I mean, we might consider it accidental manslaughter nowadays, not necessarily murder or something like that. But it was some kind of an injustice, and it had to be repaired or made even or whole. The Greeks actually viewed those kinds of things as some kind of pollution or impurity that need to be cleansed, right? So Euthyphro was doing his duty to bring his father in, even though Socrates is shocked to say, that's your own father, though, which is a kind of earlier thing in the Greek memory, prior to court systems and all of that, which had come around not much earlier than Socrates, right? Pericles and all that stuff. Democracy, the court system, everybody bringing everyone to court instead of battling them in the streets, right? This was all going on, but the previous, the older morals, like the old school Greeks, took matters into their own hands, and they didn't turn against their own fathers, right? There's loyalty and tradition and family and tribalism, us versus them, right? So Socrates is like, how do you know, Euthyphro, that the gods are, you're a holy man, how do you know the gods are going to favor you turning on your own father like that? How do you know that that's the pious, holy, or righteous thing to do? And Euthyphro says, oh, I'm not worried about this at all. I understand many things that the masses don't understand, just like you, Socrates. Yeah, I'm embellishing on it a little bit, but he says, the gods punish their own fathers, right? Even the gods are not immune to justice, right? So, and this is like Zeus punished Kronos, his father, Chronos, time, chronological from Kronos, right? For something he did wrong. So even the gods are subject to the law, to justice, right? To the scales. Blind, doesn't matter who you are, right? So Socrates is impressed by Euthyphro's reasoning. Euthyphro's reasoning, next slide is what Euthyphro does right, implies certain really good principles. One is it's an appeal to precedent. Like in the law, a lawyer will appeal to a previous case where a judge made a decision favoring a certain party and say, that's a precedent, something that was preceded, a judgment by a judge that was made previously, a preceding judgment becomes part of the case law, right? So in Jones versus Smith, the judge found in favor of Jones, but in our case, my client is just like Jones and it's a certain same kind of thing, and therefore you have to decide like he did because, next principle, like cases ought to be treated alike. And justice is blind, right? So it doesn't matter if it's my father, right? So those are some fascinating principles. Socrates kind of applauds Euthyphro for being so smart. And Euthyphro pats himself on the shoulder and says, yes, I know this and many other fine things about religion, Socrates, that the people don't understand. And Socrates is like, great, Euthyphro, please teach me. Right? I need to learn what piety is. I'm going in there and they're accusing me of being impious. Right? And implicitly I could say, you know, Euthyphro is a high priest in your religion, the religion that's charging me. But his definition of piety is this, and my behavior fits in line with that definition, right? So will you teach me? And Euthyphro says yes. So he says, okay, good, tell me then, what is piety, right? And now note, that's the first big question of the dialogue. What is this concept, right? And then the second thing is that you're about to see the Socratic Method, right? Euthyphro says he knows what piety is. He makes a problematic statement about his own father and all this. Socrates is now asking him to define piety, even though he didn't have the term definition. All right, next slide. Euthyphro's first attempted answer to the question, what is piety? Now, mark my words, the numbers between the answers and the answers that are definitions are not the same. Because the first answer to the question, what is piety, is not a definition. And Socrates says so. So then Euthyphro's second answer to the question, what is piety, is a definition, and that's the first definition. So the second answer is the first definition, and then the third answer will be the second definition, and then the fourth answer will be the third definition. All right, there might be questions on a quiz or an exam or something with those numbers mentioned, so you need to be clear on that, okay? Okay, so Euthyphro's first attempted answer to the question, what is piety, is what I'm doing now, prosecuting my father, what we were just talking about, right? And there are two problems with this, one that Socrates mentions and one that I mention, all right? So the one that Socrates mentions, just give me a moment, I want to adjust something on my screen here and take a little water. The one that Socrates mentions is that, well, that's not an example, that's merely an example, that's not a definition. Socrates doesn't have the word definition. Aristotle will invent it after seeing Socrates ask Euthyphro and others for the genus and the species, even though Socrates doesn't use those terms either, right? But Socrates asks him for the category that something belongs in, and then how it differs from other things in the category. Aristotle will extract that technique and name it the definition of definition. All right, but we'll see it in the dialogue. So Socrates says, that's a mere example. Right? I'm looking for something like a characteristic or an essence or a form of piety, its structure, so that if I have that, I can use that to differentiate cases of piety from impiety. Right? He's looking for a criterion or a definition, but he just doesn't have the term yet in Greek. Okay, so I make an example of why a mere example might not be enough. If a baby is just learning language, knows mommy and bottle and water, milk or whatever, a few words, and there's a stage at which the mother starts teaching the baby words, if the first thing she does is point up at the ceiling and say light, suppose there's a big fluorescent light under a kind of clouded glass, right? It could be just pointing up means light. It could be that the ceiling means light. It could be that the glass means light. It could mean that the color is light. It could mean that the light is light, right? It could mean anything. What's being demonstrated in the example is not that clear, but we can learn if we keep going back and forth with lots of different things, that this is light, that is light, that's not light, no, that's not light, that's glass, no, that's the ceiling, right? So you can do this, but even in the pointing, you could teach the genus and the species through a long series of examples if it becomes clear that this is this is like this and this is like that, but it's not like this and it's not like that, right? And but that would take quite a while to do that if you could just say, this is what it is. This is the category, the genus, and this is the species. This is how it's like other things, and this is how it differs from them, right? Okay, my objection, which is RR on the slide, Rick Repetti, is that Socrates wasn't sure that what Euthyphro was doing was pious, right? So for Euthyphro to say, oh, piety is what I was just doing, that's kind of circular reasoning. It's like, Euthyphro, is what you're doing pious? Yes, it is. Well, what is piety? What I was just doing, right? That doesn't really tell you anything about what piety is, and it's kind of circular reasoning. But that's Repetti's objection, right? We say that it begs the question. When something is circular reasoning, it begs the question. Instead of answering the question, it kind of begs you to just kind of accept this. So say, I believe X. Why do you believe X? Because X, right? So we just have to accept it, right? We're begging you to just accept the claim without giving you a real reason for the claim. Okay, so next slide. Euthymphro's second answer to what is piety is his first definition, right? And now think about it. When Socrates let him know that that's not a definition, that guided Euthyphro to try to give a definition. And so Euthyphro goes, oh, okay, I think I get it. What the gods love is holy or pious. What is God beloved or loved by gods is holy and pious. And what is hated by the gods is impious or unholy, right? So Socrates is like, oh, good, yes, that's a definition, that's a criterion. Good, let's test that criterion now. And this is the Socratic method. Ask you a question, you gave me an answer. Now I'm going to test the answer to see if the answer makes sense and if it's consistent with everything else that you've said or that you believe or everything else that we know. Right? So Socrates says, Euthyphro, do you believe all those stories about the gods in our religion? That Hesiod and Homer, the way the gods act and how they're kind of like at war with each other, and they use human beings as pawns in their soap opera and all that kind of thing. They disagree with each other and stuff like that. And Euthyphro says, of course I do. I'm a priest. I'm adding my own language to this just to embellish it. But then Socrates says, well, then we have a problem, Euthyphro. Sometimes some gods will love a certain thing, call it X, and other gods will hate that same thing. And the example I like to give is in the Iliad, which you should have read in junior high school or something, but I don't think they assign that anymore. But if you didn't, maybe you saw the movie Troy with Brad Pitt in a leather skirt playing the role of Achilles, which was about the Trojan War, which is what was the Iliad was about. All right? And in the movie, when the Spartans land on the beach in Troy, which is a Greek city-state, now it's in modern-day Turkey, there's a temple of Apollo right there, and I think Helen is in it. I forget the details, Paris first and Helen, love affair, started the whole war. But in any event, when Achilles and his men land on the beach, there's a temple of the god Apollo in Troy, and outside the temple, and I think that the woman to be rescued was in there, but outside the temple was a statue of the god Apollo, and when Achilles gets to it, he pulls his sword out and cuts the head of the statue of the god Apollo off. So now I'm sure the god Apollo would think that that was bad. If that's what X is, cutting the head off the statue of a god. The god whose head got cut off would probably dislike that. But the god of war, Ares, would probably think, whoa, Achilles, man, that warrior's not even afraid of God. Attaboy. That's my boy, Achilles, right? So if Euthyphro's first definition, what God's love is pious and what God's hate is impious, and Apollo hates X, but Ares loves X, right? Then X is both pious and impious. And that's a contradiction. That's like Ripetti is both married and Ripetti is a bachelor. Ripetti can't be both. He has to be one or the other, right? Contradictions can't be true. It's logically impossible. If I get around to it, I'll put a video out explaining why. All right, but it should be obvious. Something can't both be a round and a square at the exact same time in the exact same way. It's contradictory, it's impossible. So if a contradiction is stated, at least one of the things has to be false. Like either Ripetti's married or he's a bachelor. He's got to be one or the other. He can't be both. So one of those statements must be false, right? And Euthyphro seems to get it. All right, contradiction goes against meaning. Contra against diction, speech and meaning dictionary, right? So bachelor and married, contradictory. Okay, next slide, logical implications. So Euthyphro's definition, what the gods love is pious, what they hate is impious, and his polytheistic beliefs, right, lead to a contradiction, right? That some gods could love it and other gods could hate the same thing, right? So if two things are impossible, right, if the contradictions are impossible, they can't be true. So the two components of them, if they were two different things, like X and Y, if X and Y lead to a contradiction, right, then at least one of them must be false, or X and not X, right? Well, they both can't be true, so at least one of them has to be false, right? So what should Euthyphro drop? His religious beliefs or his definition? Now, if you're a monotheistic, you probably think that the problem is with more than one God. If there's only one God, there's no disagreement about X, right? So those Greeks, yeah, those silly polytheists, that's the problem. The definition is fine. What God loves is good and what God hates is bad, right? But Euthyphro can't go that route. He's a polytheist and he doesn't want to wind up being charged with heresy like Socrates. So he's got to let go of the definition, okay? So he admits it, that there's something wrong with the definition. I'm afraid so, Socrates. So next slide is kind of a joke. I have moral and philosophical implications. Most philosophers absolutely love this dialogue, not just for this one, but for the next mistake Euthyphro's going to make, because it appears to philosophers that philosophy defeats faith, or reason really, critical analysis, logical analysis, philosophical analysis applied to religion, religion falls apart, right? So I have a little chart here with a scoreboard. Philosophers 1, religious believers 0, right? I'm just being comical. But many philosophers have this view about the Euthyphro dialogue. I'm not one of them. I think in the end, it's Socrates 0 and Euthyphro 1. We'll get to that later. All right, so, but different religions, even monotheistic religions, like say, oh yeah, we don't have that problem, there's only one God. But then there's the God of Judaism, the God of Islam, the God of Christianity, the God of other religions that are monotheistic, Zoroastrianism or whatever, right? The Greeks, right, like the Spartans, their god was Ares, the god of war, right? Other Greek city-states might have favored another god or something, right? And this is kind of like in India, in different parts of India, like in South India, Ganesh, the elephant god, is prominent. In other parts, it's Krishna or Hanuman, the monkey god or whatever, right? So different people follow their different gods, even in a religion that has more than one god, but different people around the world follow this one god, that one god, and it's the same thing, right? The God of Islam disapproves of pork, but the God of Christianity says it's okay, right? So X is both good and not good according to these different gods. But then, of course, if you're a member of one of those religions, you probably just think, well, our monotheistic religion is the correct one, and the other ones are wrong. But that's what the other people think. All right, next slide. So now you're going to see Euthyphro being helped along by Socrates in transitioning to Euthyphro's third attempt, which will be his second definition. And Socrates says, well, look, you know, there are these cases where the gods disagree, but aren't there cases and things about morals that the gods agree about? And maybe like the disagreements between them are more like political disagreements, or, you know, disagreements about other things that aren't necessarily about morals and holiness and goodness and justice, right? So like, don't the gods agree, for example, that the evildoer must be punished? Right? I mean, Euthyphro said in the beginning, he implied that justice applies to all, right? So the evildoer must be punished no matter who he is, right? Even if it's one's own father. Okay, so now, you know, maybe also like the Greek gods were believed not to be like God with a capital G, the one God. The one God knows everything. So he can't be confused about what happened on the beach in Troy when Achilles got there, right? Maybe one God heard about it from another, and his talking game and testimony and hearsay and all that, right? Because the gods are not all-knowing, the Greek gods, right? They're like superheroes. Each one of them has a limited power. They're immortal, they don't die, but they have limited powers. Zeus has a power over the sky, Poseidon over the sea. Hermes is a kind of text messaging god, you know, he's the messenger god that brings messages from one to the other. So if they were all knowing, they wouldn't need a messenger god. All right, so maybe it's those all kinds of reasons why the gods might disagree about things, but the things that they agree about, maybe those are the things that are the moral things. How does that sound, Euthyphro? And Euthyphro says, yeah, I like that idea. Says, so should we revise your definition accordingly? And Euthyphro says, I see no reason why not. Right? And now RR is me on my slide here. I point out that Socrates calls himself the midwife of ideas. A midwife is someone who helps a woman give birth. Socrates thinks he's helping Euthyphro give birth to the idea. It tries to keep coming out, but it's not coming out. Push, push. You know, so he tries to help Euthyphro breathe, breathe, to get that idea to come out. He's a midwife of ideas. He does believe that people have knowledge, and he tries to help them formulate it. And a lot of it is just learning the difference between what you know and what you don't know, right? But that's still a kind of knowledge, right? This also, so it illustrates Socrates as a midwife, but it also illustrates a principle in philosophy called the principle of charitable interpretation. So that principle goes like this. In philosophy, we're not out to defeat each other. We want to have as many minds as we can to try to figure out what should we believe. So we're cooperating together. Right? If we were opposed to one another and in battle, like in a court case, then we kind of try to defeat each other. But philosophy itself is the pursuit of wisdom and understanding. What should I believe and why? Right? So if that's what you're trying to do, if that's your goal, then you should help the people that you are in debate with to formulate their argument. You should interpret what they say in the most charitable terms, in the most generous terms. The opposite of that, we call it the fallacy, which is a logical error of a straw man. right? When you mischaracterize what a person says, you put what they say in the stupidest possible light so that you can then criticize it and say, he said something that's as dumb as saying this, and anyone who says this has got to be an idiot, blah, 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 and you just dismiss the person's argument. We call it a fallacy, a logical error, because you didn't dismiss their real argument. You dismissed a bad characterization or a mischaracterization, a distortion of their argument. So that's the opposite pole, the straw man fallacy. You beat up a straw man, not a real man. It's like beating up a poster of Mike Tyson and thinking that you beat up Mike Tyson. So the principle of charity, the opposite of straw man, if you want to give somebody the strongest possible version of their argument, we call it a steel man. But if you give somebody a steel man version of their argument, the best possible version of their argument, and then you show that it's flawed, they're done for. But if you attack a straw man, the person could always come back and say, that's not what I meant this, right? Give me the benefit of the doubt. I might not have articulated it properly the first time, but this is what I meant to say, and then give you the better and better and better versions of their argument, right? So give people a steel man, not a straw man. All right, I'm going to pause here, and we're going to come back for a part two. Let me mention quickly what the third attempted answer, next slide, second definition is, revised based on the idea that there are things that the gods all agree upon. So Euthyphro's third definition is what all the gods love is pious and holy, and what all the gods hate is not. Right? And I mentioned that that's functionally equivalent to monotheism, like the monotheists noticed with the problem with the disagreeing gods. If all the gods agree, that's the same as one God. A panel of gods who all say yes, or one God who says yes. Right? That avoids the contradiction, right? Just like one God would. Right? And then Socrates asks a question. He's like, okay, great. Now we have a better definition. Let's test this one. Now here comes the big question of the dialogue. Is something pious because it's God beloved? In other words, because the gods love it? Or do the gods love it because it's pious or holy or good? Right? And Euthyphro's like, what? And Socrates tries to explain it to him, and I'm going to come back with part two shortly and explain the part two. Socrates' attempt to make Euthyphro understand the question. But I want to pause here. It's a good time to pause. But I want to say one thing, which is also on my slide, that you can ignore where it says journal question. I used to ask my students, all right, stop now and write in your journal what you think that question means, right? Because I want to stop now and ask you to just pause and think about it. Do you understand the question? Socrates' question is something pious because the gods love it? You might think, is something moral or good because the gods love it? Or do they love it because it's moral and good? Right? And also the lighting in here needs to be changed. It's getting dark. All right? But I mentioned at the bottom of my slide here that Socrates scholars themselves, I found in my reading of them, many of them are unclear about it. It's a difficult question. It's hard to explain Socrates' explanation. Socrates tries to explain it to Euthyphro. That's very confusing, but I will explain it. But I mentioned Flew. Anthony Flew is a famous philosopher of the 20th century who once said about this question that it's a kind of litmus test for a philosophical mind. How philosophical you are is whether or not you understand even what this question means. So think about what that means, and I'll be back shortly with part two. All right? I'll see you soon.